Hi guys, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm talking in English, so don't be surprised. Because today I want to share a speech with you from one Swiss guy. His name is Dr. Daniele Ganser. He's a peace researcher. Exactly on the 27th October of this year, he gave a speech in Cologne while I'm living in Germany. But at that time, I was in China. That's why I couldn't go to his speech. And his topic was whether Germany is a US-American colony. And he delivers arguments. And he goes deeper under the surface to look for facts why Germany is the US-American colony. And to talk about this, and he said we have to talk about Ukraine because actually United States uses Germany as a base. For example, the United States have military base in Ramstein, in Wiesbaden to attack Russia. For example, in Wiesbaden, the United States military trains the Ukrainian soldiers how to operate the missiles to attack Russia. Of course, he criticizes the invasion of Russia to Ukraine was illegal. But he also said, for example, in his country, in Switzerland, the narrative is one-sided. That means Russians are evil, Russians' invasion is illegal. It's very interesting. In Germany, the same. We have absolutely 100% the same narrative, one-sided narrative. We only say here in Germany, Russians' invasion was illegal, Russians are evil. I think if you are in UK or in France or in Canada, in United States, all the narrative of the Western is the same, right? And Dr. Daniele Ganser said, no, we have to look for the reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine. And this is the most important. He said it has to do with NATO eastwards expansion, not only once, multiple times. He said in the 1990s, as Soviet Union collapsed, the Western, that means the United States, the NATO promised do not expansion NATO 1 single inch to the east. But what we saw afterwards, as I said before, not only once, but many, many times, the NATO expanded itself to the east, already to the border of Russia. And then in 2008, in Budapest, there was a conference. Russia was also there. At that time, I think George Bush was on power, or Obama. Anyway, United States said, we wanted to take Ukraine and Georgia. Georgia is another Eastern Bloc country, NATO, into the NATO. We wanted these two countries to be the new members of NATO. Of course, Russia, the president at that time, I think also Putin said, no, we don't like this idea. We don't like it. We are against it. But we saw afterwards, the NATO gives hope to Ukraine, or we will take you into the NATO. And then 2014 and so on, many things happened. And Ukraine was trying everything to become a member and then to anger Russia, right? And in his speech, that means in the speech of Dr. Daniele Ganser, he said, in the 60s, there was Cuba crisis. At that time, Russia wanted to put the rockets, the weapons on Cuba. Was the United States happy about that? No. They were strongly against it. That was the reason of Cuba crisis. Now, 30 years later, and in Ukraine, United States and NATO want to do the same as the Russia at that time. Of course, Russia was against it. But NATO and Ukraine are doing this and doing that and so on to make Russia angry. And that was the main reason of Russia's invasion to Ukraine. But in the West, people don't talk about it. People only say Russia is evil. Russian invasion is illegal. One-sided narrative. And then he said in his speech why he thinks Germany is a colony of the United States. Because he thinks USA bombed the German Nord Stream pipeline. It's a pipeline between Russia and Germany to let Germany and Europe to get very cheap Russian energy. But the United States say, we don't like Nord Stream pipeline. At that time, Mr. Biden, the president of the United States, said openly at a press conference, he said, we can get rid of Nord Stream pipeline. And what happened later? It was bombed. And Dr. Ganser said, the Swiss guy, said, in Germany, nobody, really nobody talks about it. No politician, no journalist, no normal German even wants to talk about this pipeline. Who bombed this pipeline? Nobody cares about it. Maybe the Germans are afraid to talk about this. Everybody just keeps silent. Okay, guys, that was the summary of his talk. So in the following, you will hear or you will watch his talk. Have fun, enjoy. So guys, if you have any comments, can you write down please? Where you are, for example, if you are in another country, what's the narrative about the Russian invasion? It is illegal or it is understandable? So write down your comments. Thank you.
So I'm going to present you my data, and you don't have to agree with it, not at all. Historians have many different perspectives. To the left, there's Donald Trump, who's the president of the United States, and to the right is Friedrich Merz, the Bundeskanzler, who's the head, he's like the president in Germany in that sense. I've written a book which is called USA, the Ruthless Empire. United States today, from 193 countries, is the most powerful country. They have the highest defense spending, and they have attacked the biggest amount of countries in the last 80 years, the empire of our days. But it's not something that is publicly said in Switzerland. We try not to anger Donald Trump, or we try not to anger the United States, so we don't say the United States is an empire. But as a historian, I have a certain liberty, and I can say, for me, this is now the empire. The United States obviously has an ocean, the Pacific Ocean on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other side, and Europe is far away. And then I study American literature of American geostrategists, and they say, okay, in Europe, Russia is very powerful, Germany is very powerful. If Germany and Russia work together, that'd be very bad for us. So we always have to try to split them up. And this is something which has been said by George Friedman. This man, he's an American geostrategist. He says, the United States controls all the oceans. No other power has ever done that, because the Americans have a very strong navy, also a very strong air force. Therefore, we can invade any country in the world, and no one can invade us, and that is a beautiful thing. That's what he said in Chicago in 2015. For Americans, that means they have these two oceans, here the Atlantic and here the Pacific, that protect them very well. And they know that their challengers are in Eurasia. Eurasia is Europe and Asia combined. And they say big challengers are obviously China, but also Russia. And they say the powerhouse of Europe, Germany, is always a challenger for the United States. I've then, in the last 20 years, researched different conflicts of the United States, which countries they have bombed. They've obviously bombed. When you research US imperialism in detail, it can even become tricky, because in European universities, it's not normal that you talk about all these wars that the United States have fought in the last 8 years. But I've made a list. They were in Korea, obviously, Korean War. This is my most critical finding. In 2014, they overthrew the government in Ukraine. I've written that in my book. And many people go, no, that's impossible. The US has never intervened in Ukraine. It is the Russians who intervened. And that's where the whole problem in Ukraine started. I say, no, according to my analysis, and you don't have to agree with me. You can check it for yourself. Americans tried to drag Ukraine into NATO and therefore overthrew the government on 20 February 2014. Looking at US imperialism is a difficult thing. It's not being taught at universities. It's not being taught in mainstream television because, obviously, if you look at that list, it's a delicate subject. But one US president, his name was Jimmy Carter, spoke openly about it. He said in 2019 that the United States of America is the most belligerent nation in the history of the world. Of its 240-year existence as a nation, mere 16 years have been spent without war. And he said that when he was 94 years old, and that was during a church service, because he's a Christian and he was sort of feeling sorry for all the people that were killed. It's very important to distinguish between the American population. There's a population of 330 million people in the United States. They don't actually want to attack another country, but they have a very small ruling class in the United States. And they say, oh, we have to bomb Vietnam, or we have to bomb Serbia, or we have to bomb Iraq, or we have to bomb Libya. And people in the United States often don't actually know where all these countries are. When I was traveling in the United States, I met people and they said, where are you from? I said, from Switzerland. And they said, Switzerland, I know Switzerland. Pippi Langstrumpf and ABBA. And I said, no, that's Sweden. And I said, but that's all Europe. And I said, yeah, it's all Europe. You can put it like that. But it just means that it's not the US population who wants all these wars. I really have very good friends in the United States. But it's usually the presidents and the foreign ministers who attack other countries, and the defense industry, which really makes millions and millions out of all these wars. So the question comes down, how about Germany? Because Germany is now in a very big crisis. They have very high energy prices, and they used to have very cheap gas coming from Russia. It really made the Germans rich. You have to put it that way. Very cheap gas coming out from Russia through pipelines. It was very good for the German economy. So they had the Nord Stream pipelines, and the Russians really were making the Germans rich. And now these Nord Stream pipelines were blown up. And the question obviously is, what's really the situation between Trump and Merz? Who's boss and who's slave? What's going on? And one of the key issues that this relationship between Germany and Russia has always been of very great interest to American strategists, because people have said here in Germany, they work a lot, okay? They're very precise, they work a lot, hardworking people. And the Russians, they have a lot of oil and gas. So if all the oil and gas links up with the powerhouse of Europe, because Germany is the powerhouse of Europe when it comes to the economy, then both will thrive and will be powerful. The Russians will become rich, and the Germans will become powerful. So the Americans were thinking about it, and they said, then we have to break this axis between Berlin and Moscow. We have to make them fight each other, and that will solve a problem. We have two competitors which are then swept away. And that is, again, George Friedman, how he said it. I've never met George Friedman, but I've listened to what he said. The main interest of the United States, over which for a century we have fought wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. The Cold War is basically from 1947 to 1991. 1991 is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Has been the relationship between Germany and Russia, because united, that's the very important word. United, they're the only force that could threaten us. So the main interest of the United States is to make sure that that doesn't happen, that Germany and Russians are not united. And therefore, we do have a debate which is going on, which says, that's why the Americans blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. It's a huge debate. There's some people who say, no, the Ukrainians did it. They had a yacht, the Andromeda, and then they did it. But on the basis of my research, I'm convinced that the Americans blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. It happened on the 26th of September, 2022. So it's already 3 years ago now. Today, if you talk to business leader in Germany, many will tell you, okay, it has become more difficult. In the meantime, energy prices have gone up. We have a hard time, and it really has dealt a very heavy blow to Germany. It's not a small thing to blow up a pipeline, because some people go, yeah, come on, you can't research everything. But if you don't research the blowing up of pipelines, you really lose track of the big events that happened. And it was actually an American journalist, his name is Seymour Hersh, who investigated this question, because he has very good contacts in the CIA and in the Pentagon. And Seymour Hersh then published a paper where he said how America took out the Nord Stream pipelines. And he published this in February 2023. I think Seymour Hersh is a very honest man, a very courageous man. It's not only that the Americans blew up the pipelines, they also have the journalists who then said we did it. So, there's both in the United States. And these pipelines, just to give you the map, they brought gas directly from Russia through the Ostsee to Germany. We're obviously a bit further down, but we're now in Germany. And that was a very good situation because through the pipelines, if you get gas through pipelines, it's much cheaper than if you bring it with LNG over the Atlantic Ocean. At the time, Joe Biden was the president, and he was behind the whole thing, Seymour Hersh says. Now, obviously, today, we don't know whether Joe Biden remembers that because in his last years, when he was in office, he lost it. Like, he couldn't think straight anymore. And Seymour Hersh then revealed the Biden administration was doing everything possible to avoid leaks as the planning took place in late 21. That's important. The planning to take out the Nord Stream started before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and into the first months of 22. And the key players were Jake Sullivan. He was the national security advisor of President Joe Biden. Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Victoria Nuland. She was the Undersecretary of State. And she also surfaces when we research the coup in Ukraine in 2014. So according to my research, Victoria Nuland was both involved in blowing up the pipeline and in overthrowing the government in Ukraine. Two crucial events which should be discussed more openly in Europe, but most people don't talk about it. It's like this, hush, let's not talk about it thing. And President Biden, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, Victoria Nuland had been vocal and consistent in their hostility to the Nord Stream pipeline, Seymour Hersh reports. And it was interesting when the pipeline was taken out, former Polish defense minister Radoslaw Sikorski wrote, "Thank you, USA." Just that was one day after it had been taken out. So he understood the framework that the United States wants to break the cooperation between Germany and Russia. The map again, here's Russia, here's Moscow, here's Berlin. And actually, if these two work together very closely, is profitable for Europe, is profitable for Germany, it in the end is also profitable for Switzerland, for many countries around Germany. But if this axis is broken, German economy will go down and all the countries around will have less money. There are different American analysts, and one of them is Scott Ritter. And Scott Ritter then said the blowing up of Nord Stream was an attack by the US on Germany. The Germans should be ashamed if they can't see that. And they say, if you can't see it, take down the German flag, hiss the US flag, and recognize that you're a US colony. So he was very outspoken and said, it's so obvious that the United States just blew up your critical infrastructure. If you just accept that, then you're a colony. Then you're not a sovereign nation strong enough to say we don't accept that. And the funny thing was that at the time it happened, the German chancellor happened to be in Washington. He was in Washington, and then he was meeting with Joe Biden, and then a journalist said, what's going to happen about Nord Stream? And Joe Biden said, we want this to stop. We don't want the Germans to have any gas from Russia. And then the journalist asked, but how are you going to do it? And then Joe Biden said, we have our ways.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly? Since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control.
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
And the German chancellor was just standing right next to him, and he didn't say anything. So this is a very interesting thing, which is also being discussed in France. There's a French historian, his name is Emmanuel Tot, and he says the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline proves that Germany is an occupied country. So this is a discourse which is going on now. And it's not only that the Nord Stream pipeline blowing up is one indication that Germany is not really sovereign. The next thing is that there are a lot of American troops. The biggest US Army base is Ramstein. You won't see it, if you leave the hotel here today. It's not that the Americans are everywhere and you sort of see the American flag and everywhere says Germany is a US colony. That's not how it is. It's very invisible. But if you go to Ramstein, you will see this is one of the big Air Force bases of the Americans in Europe. Tucker Carlson is an American journalist, and he had a debate with a German journalist, and he said, "Why are there 33,000 US soldiers in Germany?" That's Tucker Carlson. That's the American journalist. And he asked the German journalist Paul Ronsheimer of the German Zeitung Bild, which is quite a well-known but not very high-quality newspaper. And then Tucker Carlson says, "I don't understand why you allow your country to remain occupied." So actually there is a discourse in the United States, but not in Germany, of whether actually it's an occupied country or not. And if you go back in history, if you go back to the Cold War, some of you might remember that Germany was on the front line. So the front line in the Cold War, this was, communist world, and this was capitalist world. And so this was the Soviet Union, and Germany was split, okay? This part, BRD, and this part, DDR. So this one was capitalist, and this one was communist or socialist. And then these two countries were reunited in 1990. And the question was, what do we do? I mean, do we take all of Germany into NATO, or do we make it a neutral country? The Americans insisted that Germany has to stay in NATO. And then the Americans pushed NATO further to Russia. And that's something I really want to emphasize. We don't think very often in the head of the Russians. The Russians don't like it, okay? The Russians don't like the advancement of NATO closer to their border, and that's why we have the war in Ukraine. But it's not being told like that in Swiss newspapers or Swiss television shows. It's always said, the Russians are evil and the Russians just invaded Ukraine for no reason. But that's not true. It was actually the Americans which pushed NATO further into the directions of Russia. And I can show you this because, the Russians took all their troops out here from the DDR. They took them out, 500,000 troops. And the Americans promised, in return, we will not expand NATO 1 inch. Okay, but the Americans also promised to the Apache that, they will not move further to the Pacific. And then later we have Albania and Croatia joining NATO, Montenegro, North Macedonia. Then Finland and Sweden are the last 2 states who have joined. And from the American perspective, they also wanted Ukraine. They also wanted to have Ukraine in NATO because then you can put your missiles close to the Russian border. That's the whole game. So we have to really focus on Ukraine. And the way it's being told, the story, I don't know about your country, Spain or Finland, it's really good to be in an international crowd because, there's different perspectives. But probably in your country, the story is also told the same way that we hear it in Switzerland. The story we hear in Switzerland is the Russians are evil, they just invaded. For no reason, really. That's how it's told. But that's not true. It's much more complicated. The Americans tried to drag Ukraine into NATO. And US President Bush said in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania, that Ukraine must become a NATO member. NATO announced in the so-called Bucharest Memorandum that it intended to admit Ukraine and Georgia as members. And then there was a very short war, the Georgia War, in August 2008, 888. That's one of these simple dates in history. Putin was also at the conference in 2008, and he said Russia doesn't want Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. They see it as an existential threat. Ukraine shares a 1,200-mile land border with Russia, parts of which are just 400 miles from Moscow. And Putin then warned that this would be a direct threat to the security of Russia. And this is something that we should keep in mind. If we want to solve this conflict in Ukraine, we must also think about this NATO enlargement thing. And one American professor who worked on the subject is John Mersheimer. And he says, the trouble over Ukraine actually started at NATO's Bucharest summit in April 2008, when George Bush administration pushed the alliance to announce that Ukraine and Georgia will become members. So there are people in NATO countries, US, UK, Germany, who know that it was a mistake. Another one is Sir Roderick Lyne. He was the British ambassador to Russia from 2000 to 2004. And he said, 2008 Bucharest summit, it was a massive mistake on the Western side trying to push Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. It was stupid on every level at that time. If you want to start a war with Russia, that's the best way of doing it. Moreover, any poll in Ukraine showed that 2/3 of Ukrainian public did not want to become NATO members. So that was the second problem that the United States had. The Ukrainians themselves didn't want to join NATO. And the president in Ukraine, his name was Yanukovych at the time, he didn't want to join NATO either. So if you go back to the year 2013 and to early 2014, at that time, go to the capital in Ukraine, which is Kiev. And in Kiev, in that capital, go to the Maidan. The Maidan is a very beautiful space in Kiev. And you had protesters and you had police forces. And so you had two groups coming together on that Maidan. This is the president. He was then in charge. He was Viktor Yanukovych. He didn't want to join NATO. And he was overthrown by the United States on 20 February 2014. You will see many other commentators who say, no, that's not true. And that the US was not involved, and it was just a democratic election. No, it was not a democratic election. Yanukovych, on that day, saw that the whole country fell into chaos. And we can now understand, 11 years later, how it happened. You had snipers who went up on the buildings, and then they shot both demonstrators and the police, and then they withdrew. That's a very complicated thing because it happens very quickly, okay? So you have dead demonstrators, you have dead policemen, around 100 dead. That's the first 100 dead. Now we have more than 1 million people killed in Ukraine. But these first 100, that's the most important group we have to look at because it happened so quickly that people didn't realize what happened. The demonstrators thought the police had killed them, and the police thought the demonstrator had killed them. You know, they thought in two blocks, but there was a third group, the third group, which were the snipers. And then this was blamed on Yanukovych. People said, well, he's killing his own population. And then Yanukovych left Ukraine and fled to Russia. Joe Biden at the time, very important, was vice president, and Obama was the president. But people never linked Joe Biden or Obama to the overthrow of the government in Kiev in 2014, because that's never in the narrative. Victoria Nuland, I've already said, she was involved in blowing up Nord Stream. She was also blowing up Ukraine in the sense that she was involved in that coup. She was pulling the strings together with Jeffrey Pyatt, who was the US ambassador to Ukraine, and the phone communication between Nuland and Ambassador Pyatt, where they discussed the composition of the government before the coup, were intercepted. And that caused quite an uproar in the European Union because Nuland said, fuck the EU, which hard to translate. It just basically means we won't integrate the European Union in this process. We now know, it's 11 years later, that the snipers were in the Hotel Ukraine. And that's very important because the Hotel Ukraine was controlled by the demonstrators. And this is the conservatory, and they were also here. And there's a very courageous researcher. His name is Katkanovsky, and he is in Canada. And he researched all the video material, all the sniper data of that day. And he says, various videos reveal snipers in the Maidan-controlled buildings, such as Hotel Ukraine. This is the one here. And he says the Maidan massacre of the protesters and the police on February 20, 2014 was a successful false flag operation that was rationally organized and conducted by elements of the Maidan leadership and concealed groups of Maidan snipers in Maidan-controlled buildings in order to seize power. It's very hard to understand the situation. The demonstrators killed their fellow demonstrators and blamed it on the president, who then looked bad. This is how it was done. As many people go like, no, I can't believe it, and this doesn't happen. But if you look at the data, I'm convinced that that's the truth. The Maidan massacre in Ukraine is now a new book. And Jeffrey Sachs, who's an American analyst, he says, recognizing that the war was provoked helps us to understand how to stop it. He says it's very important to find a solution to the war in Ukraine And we will never find a solution if we say it's only Russia's fault. Russia invaded and the Russians are evil. That way we cannot solve the conflict. It's better to say, okay, Russian invasion was illegal, but also NATO expansion was not a very smart idea because it angered Russia. And the coup d'etat in 2014 was also illegal. There were, in fact, two main U.S. provocations. The first was U.S. intention to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia in order to surround Russia in the Black Sea region by NATO countries. And the second was the U.S. role in installing a Russophobic regime in Ukraine by the violent overthrow of Ukraine's pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014. That's the one thing I've just explained. But if you discuss this here in Germany, the government doesn't really like it, because the German government tries to sell the story that all the problems have started with the Russian invasion, and before there was nothing, okay? So if you talk about this false flag sniper attack in 2014, which I did, and I give many public lectures in Germany, I very often have demonstrators outside of the building and police force and stuff. So I'm very happy we're a small group here today and we can just casually talk about these issues. But the issue is such that the Americans then, after the Russian invasion, used Germany as their main base, okay? They had in Wiesbaden, they had the Ukrainian soldiers, generals coming to Wiesbaden in Germany, and then told them where to fire, okay, where to kill Russians. And then first they said, let's shoot at Russians in Ukraine. And then the Americans changed their tactic and said, and now we can kill Russians which are still in Russia. And this happened, and the New York Times wrote an article, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. It was published in March 2025. And it's important to keep in mind that this war has been fought with long-range missiles. So you can't actually see the other one. You can't see the other soldier. Some of these weapons are artillery, like this one, M777, HIMARS, and ATACMS. And for all these systems were supplied from the United States, shipped over the Atlantic, given Ukraine. But the Ukrainians, they couldn't see the opponent. So they really needed the Americans to give them the signals intelligence, the data. Where are the Russians? Because they move. They're not just on one spot. They move. And then the Americans gave them this data. And this was General Donahue. He ran a task force Dragon, which he called, and that was in Wiesbaden. So the Americans used Germany as a colony to actually conduct the war in Ukraine. That's highly, highly dangerous. Highly, highly dangerous. And the headquarters were in Wiesbaden, and this is Chris Donahue. And the Ukrainians were then asking, why can't we trust your GPS data? Why should we shoot there where you give us the data? And Donahue said, trust us, you will be happy with the results. That made it very, very dangerous also for Germany, because the Russians obviously saw that the Americans used Germany as a base to coordinate the war in Ukraine. American intelligence guided Ukrainian artillery with cooperation so deep that NATO officers described the US as part of the kill chain. The US often says, we're not involved in this war in Ukraine. But actually they have the satellites who give the signals intelligence, which is then used for GPS signals. And this is Task Force Dragon. And in August 24, so last year, they fired on Russia. And that was even more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was no American soldiers being killed in the US, But now in this crisis, we have Russian soldiers being killed in Russia from a base in Germany, where Ukrainians are informed by American soldiers. Very, very complicated situation. So these are these systems that are being used. So actually it would be interesting to have a debate in Germany, but there's no debate. If you talk about somebody, if you meet somebody tonight in the pub and you go like, hey, have you heard about this Task Force Dragon? And is it true that actually the Americans have blown up Nord Stream? And why don't you actually protest? People will not talk about it. It's not something people want to talk about. It's like, oh yeah, there are some problems, but let's not talk about it. So it's really under the rock. It's really under the rock. Zelensky then, for the first time in November, fired a ATACMS missile into Russia. At that time, that makes it very difficult. People say that Joe Biden, who was president in the United States, gave the go-ahead. But the problematic thing is that in November 2024, Joe Biden was not well, He was not, I don't think he was able to understand the situation at all. So the question is, who gave the go-ahead? What happened? And the Russians have now conquered these areas in eastern Ukraine. And in the end, it will be possible to solve the conflict. Obviously, we need talks between Putin and Trump, because Ukraine really is a war where people just used Ukrainians. Really, the Americans just used Ukraine. One American general said, this is a very good war. We are not losing our own boys. We're just sending the weapons, and we have the Ukrainians kill the Russians. And, if there's a lot of Ukrainians killed, we don't care. And furthermore, the Russians and the Germans are completely split, which is another great idea, because we've broken two European powers and they're now fighting against each other. So this is a discourse that is important to have. I think it's very important. The Germans were obviously also invited to Trump. Here's Trump. But they put Merz over here. He could almost not see Trump. He had to be in the corner. And although Germany is the most powerful country in Europe. So is Germany a colony of the United States? That was my question. I think, yes, you could argue so. Not officially, obviously. The official history is that Germany is totally independent, has its own foreign policy, and is a sovereign nation. That's, what you learn in school classes, what you hear on television, and what you read in newspapers. But if you look on the factual level, Germany has not done anything after Nord Stream was blown up. There's nothing. There's not even, a protest to the American government, nothing. Because usually you'd argue that within NATO countries, one country would not attack the other one. So Germany has not reacted, and that to me is an indication that it's like a colony. Second point is Germany has been used as a military base. Wiesbaden was used to fight the war in Ukraine, still is. So that's another element of a colony. And third, you obviously have 33,000 US soldiers based in Germany. So I thought this is maybe something interesting to think about. Dominic asked me, bring something along which is thought-provoking. And that was basically my talk. I thank you very much for your attention. It's not necessary, right, to agree with a historian, because if you have like 5 or 6 historians, they will always disagree. You have a Chinese historian, you have a Serbian historian, you have a French historian, and have a Cuban historian. They disagree. Okay? So this is just the perspective of a Swiss historian. But I do very firmly believe that we get a very one-sided picture in Switzerland, and maybe in your country that's the same. I don't know. I don't read your newspaper. I don't know. But in Switzerland, the story that we get is the Russians are evil. They are to blame for everything. And I do agree that the Russian invasion into Ukraine was illegal. You can't invade another country. That's illegal. But we do have to keep in mind that NATO expansion provoked Russia. And we do have to keep in mind that the Americans, according to my research, overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014. So with no further ado, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.